Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome Toyosi Onwuemene. She's a hematologist. Her Kevin MD article is titled Unlocking the Hidden Potential of Physician Scientists, the Key to Research Breakthroughs and Healthcare Innovation. Toyosi, welcome to the show.
Kevin, thank you for having me.
So we'll get into the article in a little bit. First off, briefly share your story and journey.
Sure. So I was a new faculty member 10 years ago looking for a job as a clinician scientist. And I was told I wasn't qualified. I didn't have the right number of publications. I didn't have the right funding. They couldn't make the case for me that I could take on the job as a clinician scientist. And so it took me years to make that transition from full-time clinician to mostly clinician researcher. And I realized that it really takes transformation to make that transition. And many clinicians don't have the resources to make it. So what I do is I help people make that transition, negotiate their academic careers so that they can lead the research programs and make the breakthroughs that they want.
Now, for those who aren't familiar with the career of a physician scientist, talk more about what that is.
Oh, absolutely. So you all get the clinician training. Some people will go on and do a PhD as part of that. But for the most part, there isn't really dedicated time in our 10 years or more of
Yeah.
clinical training for research training. And so, really, the initial part of that career, starting as a faculty member, is learning the research training. It's getting the research skills that are needed to actually lead an independent research program. And over time, as you acquire those skills, then you're really able to lead people to accomplish a certain research vision in looking and answering questions related to patient care so that you can ultimately enhance patient care. And it really takes time. It takes years to really answer a question well that leads to the kind of breakthroughs that we're looking for. And that's why there's the need for investment up front, because a lot of that initial investment is really training to get people to where they need to be.
Now, how did you yourself learn about that whole research component, leading a research division, leading a lab? How did you learn about that?
That is a really great question. I will tell you that when I first started, all I knew is that I wanted to do research. That's all I
Yeah,
knew. I didn't
yeah.
even really understand what it entailed. And over time, what I recognized as I started having mentors, especially external mentors, coming into my life and sharing with me the pathway, I realized I was totally unprepared. And so some of that looked for me like creating structure around my writing. So when you're a research scientist, you're actually a communicator. You're communicating with funders to get them to support your research. You're communicating with your peers so that they can look and see where your blind spots are in considering the research. And you're also communicating with the public because people need to know what you've discovered so that they can apply it to also enhance future discoveries as well. So even just creating the kind of structure that allowed me to succeed and manage my clinical loads so that I could really have research productivity was something that was new to me, and it really took me time to learn it.
And just to be clear, during a traditional clinical medical pathway, a lot of these research skills that you just mentioned aren't typically taught. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So, research skills such as actually learning to boil a big, huge, complex research question into something that you can answer. I mean, that really does take time to learn. Things like learning to write scientifically, learning to shepherd manuscripts through the publication process, learning to write research proposals and what to do when proposals are rejected. I mean, those are all skills that it takes time to learn. So, no, none of it is part of our clinical training.
Now, how many years did it take you before you felt proficient or comfortable in that research component?
Wow, that's a really great question. I will tell you that it's an ongoing journey.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone ever feels like they've arrived. And I would say that now I would call myself a clinician scientist, but it wasn't my story initially. Maybe it wasn't even the first grant. It wasn't the first published manuscript. It was just this growing realization that I had made a mindset shift that allowed me to really call myself a clinician scientist.
All right. And you're going to talk more about that in your Kevin MD article titled Unlocking the Hidden Potential of Physician Scientists, the Key to Research Breakthroughs and Healthcare Innovation. Now, tell us, how did your article come together?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about the process of the transformation. Now, what I realize in retrospect is that it's actually impossible. It's impossible to make this transformation while you're 100% clinical because clinical work is, I mean, I don't have to tell our audience,
Yeah.
it's all consuming. And to be able to do that, you really do need to gradually kind of negotiate your way into the protected time that you need to get this training and to launch the career, the research career. So as I was thinking about my process and starting really to share with faculty that I coach, I had to think about where did this all start from, and what does it take, and why is it important that clinicians are encouraged to lead research programs if that's what they want to do. And that's really what led me to start thinking about putting it into words so that others have a sense of the importance and the urgency of making this possible for other clinicians.
So tell us some of those coaching tips that you mentioned. So if a clinician comes up to you and where you were years ago and say, I want to do research as part of my career, now what do you advise them?
Absolutely. So, one of the things I advise is to think about your negotiations in two ways. Number one is the macro negotiation, and everybody's aware of that. You're negotiating salary, you're negotiating space, you're negotiating your schedule. And some people come prepared to that. I think most clinicians are actually unprepared for those negotiations, but those are the big negotiations that everybody's familiar with and at least to some extent prepared for. The negotiations that clinicians are not as prepared for are the micro negotiations. So how do you negotiate your schedule? How do you negotiate collaborations? How do you negotiate your mentoring relationships? And those are the things that ultimately impact more upon your life as a clinician scientist because they're happening every day. And so if you're going to master the art of negotiating your career, you're going to do it in the micro negotiations. So in the day-to-day negotiations that allow you to really carve out time to do the work that's needed. Now, you may negotiate 75% protected time on paper, and then you get to a clinic that's overflowing, and there's no way that 75% is materializing. So how do you negotiate what you have on paper into reality? And so those are things that are important for my clients, and I talk about often.
So I talk to a lot of attorneys, when it comes to physician contracts, but this is specifically for clinician scientists and for researchers, which seems like a pretty specialized field. Where can they turn to for advice? Are there coaches and mentors like yourself? Are they pretty prevalent? Because a lot of those micro negotiations that you mentioned, I wouldn't even know to ask those questions. Like, where can they turn to for help?
Absolutely. Those are great questions. I would say that there's a growing body of us who are helping faculty negotiate on the micro level. And for us, we actually have an academic negotiation academy that we do, and it's a 12-week boot camp and helping people really hone the skills to negotiate well. And we actually have a master class that we're doing August 21st, and that's for anybody who's interested in just learning what could that entail. So definitely there are a lot of coaches that are arising in this area because the need is great. I think faculty need to succeed. And what happens is when they don't succeed, they're dissatisfied, they're burned out in their
Yeah.
jobs, and the institution doesn't win either. So it really is a win-win for faculty to negotiate the jobs that they want as clinician scientists.
So I was wondering if you could share with us maybe a couple of anecdotes or stories. Tell us a story where a negotiation didn't work out in the favor of the clinician scientist, and maybe tell us a contrasting story where it was a success story and the right questions were being asked and answered. So just give us two contrasting stories about potential pathways of clinician scientists.
Sure. I will say that I will use myself as a story, as an example. So when I first started negotiating, when I came to my first negotiation, I kind of knew the commentary around women don't negotiate. And so I was so prepared. I was like, I'm going to negotiate. And all I thought to negotiate was my salary. And at the end of that negotiation, I did negotiate a higher salary than was proposed to me. However, I missed that I didn't have administrative support. And so I started my faculty job without administrative support, doing all these clerical tasks. And what that effectively did was decrease the value of the salary I had negotiated because I was doing extra work that was uncompensated. And so what came out from that for me is just the importance of considering all aspects of the negotiation in order to ensure success. What is a contrary story? And so clearly I'm a clinician scientist now. I have the resources I need to do the research and to lead my research program. And some of that really came from sitting down and saying, hey, this is the path that I am treading. This is the value that I bring. And so part of that is do you recognize the value you're bringing so that you can negotiate value for value? And so it took me a while to figure out, wait a minute, this is the value I bring. And so I was able to sit down and talk about, okay, in order to really enhance this value and accelerate and really do the work that enhances my institution, these are the resources I need. And it wasn't in this particular negotiation, it was really more of it was formal. It was like, here is the letter, and you respond, and then I would respond. It wasn't, in a sense, it's not that it wasn't friendly, but it was really important because it needed to be taken seriously. And so I think, I think I'm giving the example of a macro negotiation, but really there were many micro negotiations to get there. So by this time, I improved my publication record. I had some funding under my belt. I had demonstrated that with the little I had, I could make something happen. And then it was that, well, if I'm going to go to the next phase, this is what's necessary. Are you willing to put your money where your mouth is?
Now, as you know, a lot of physicians aren't comfortable directly negotiating with their employer, right? So a lot of times they do this through a third party or an attorney. Is this something that's typically done through an attorney, or is it something that the physician scientists should do themselves?
Wow, that's a really great question. I would say that probably if you're thinking about involving an attorney, that's probably at the very beginning with the contract negotiation piece. The reality, I think, for many people, many faculty and academic centers, is that what's written on paper and what happens when you show up to the job can be quite different. And really bringing an attorney at that point it may not help the faculty member achieve the goals that they want. And so really, I think there's kind of like a nuanced a nuanced strategy to really negotiate for what they want. It can't be confrontational because you're going to continue to work in this job. You want to, and you're at that institution because you recognize that there are resources that help you succeed. So at the end, what you're really doing is helping to get your institution on the same side of the table as you, seeing that this is going to be a win-win. And that's why I think there are many of us coaches springing up in this area, because we recognize that it's not kind of like, I think the hardball negotiation that we think about. It really is, how do you even create space so that you can say, these are the wins I have, and now let's take the wins and expand them. And it's really understanding the intricacies of the academic environment and what it really takes to be successful.
How about the variations between academic environments? Do you see a lot of variation there? You're at Duke and hundreds of academic environments out there. So do you see some variation across the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that one of the things I teach my clients is that you got to get external mentors, external peer mentors, and external senior mentors, because at the end of the day, institutions are a little bit different, but
Yeah.
the big overarching themes are the same. What is the value that you're bringing to scholarly activity? Do people know your work? How are you contributing? And so in general, things like publications and grant funding are important across institutions. And how do different institutions solve these problems? They solve them differently. And so it's helpful to have the external perspective, because then you can say, oh, this is working here. How can I take it back to my institution and make it work for me? So for me, that was one of my biggest aha moments was, wow, other people are doing it, but doing it differently and doing it in a way that's effective. And how can I take that and use it for myself? And so I always encourage my clients, I'm like, don't just stay within your institution. Don't do all the career development programs that your institution has without considering what else is out there.
So we've talked about things that the clinician scientist should ask for or look out for. Now let's flip the coin. What are some red flags that you typically see when among your clients or academic institutions that they should watch out for, that they should beware of when they're negotiating, a potential position as a clinician scientist?
That's a really great question. I would say the red flag on the part of the client is desperation.
Hmm.
You cannot be desperate going into a job negotiation. I mean, you've got to be able to walk away if it doesn't get you what you want. And I think that's important, that clients are considering the long game. I mean, if you're going to go into a career in research, you're not going to get the rewards of your investment in a year, in 2 years. It really is a long game. So you've got to be prepared to negotiate for the long game and to do what it takes to get there. And so sometimes what I see clinicians doing is just taking the first thing that
Hmm.
is thrown at them, just because they're like, I desperately need a job. I have so much debt. Give me a job right now. And the reality is that we have so many options. And if we don't get the job right away, it's okay. But just considering that we can't be desperate when we go in to negotiate. I think red, oh,
Sorry, go on.
well, I was going to say red flags from the perspective of the institution is just to see how faculty are doing. Who are the people who 2 or 3 years ahead of you in the same kind of role? Who has left and why have they left? Having all that information is important, I think, so that faculty are making an informed decision.
How about red flags in terms of during that negotiation process? Anything that should raise alarms when a clinician scientist is listening to what the academic center has to say?
That's a great question. I do think that listening and trying to get the information is going to be really important. I do think one of the challenges is that there's a big power differential, right?
Yeah,
The faculty member barely has a negotiation experience. I don't know about you, but negotiation training was not part of
yeah,
my clinical training. But the academic institution has decades and
yeah,
sometimes centuries of negotiation training under their belt, and certainly thousands of academic negotiations. So, to be honest, I think that no faculty member should go into this negotiation without help.
yeah.
And the more help people have, the more successful they are. And so I would say that, allowing if the institution is saying, well, no, you can't have help, or no, you don't have time to think about this, or no, we're not going to budge on that, those are red flags. Because if people are not congenial and able to give and take, then that, I mean, they're on their best behavior. So if you're getting any kind of negative vibes and you can't clearly articulate what that's about, you just need to pause and try to clarify what those are, because when you go into the job, you're kind of stuck. And for many faculty, I don't think anyone can clearly say, oh, this was a total surprise to me. I think the flags are evident, but sometimes it takes somebody else objectively walking you through the process so that you can more objectively appreciate the concerns. And at the end of the day, there's no perfect job. And that's why micro negotiations are important, because whatever you get, you're going to keep negotiating and renegotiating until you get to satisfaction. And to be honest, we're never satisfied. And so it's like you get to the point of satisfaction and you're like, what else could I become? And that's another series of negotiations. So ultimately, there's no perfect job, but making sure that you have resources and help can help you kind of avoid some pitfalls.
And my final question, tell us some of your take home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin and the audience.
Sure. I think I would say that clinicians are capable of anything. They can do everything. And to be honest, we're great negotiators because we negotiate for our patients and we negotiate well. And what we do need to do is just get the information that we need to be able to negotiate on behalf of ourselves. And it is hard. That's why it makes sense to have someone come alongside you. Some people have mentors that can help them do it. But for many of us, we actually do have to seek out the services of a coach. And I would just say that no matter what you need, or no matter what your circumstances or your resources, reach out for help. Don't go it alone. And you may be already in a job, you've negotiated poorly. It doesn't matter. You can negotiate and negotiate again.
Toyosi, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. Thanks again for being on the show.
It's been a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Kevin.